Alrighty. Coming to you guys live. Welcome, everybody. Thanks, guys, for joining us today. Everyone out there, if you are joining us live here on LinkedIn or YouTube, then again, as usual, feel free to send in your comments, your thoughts. We're going to be talking about a handful of legislative matters regarding counter UAS or counter drone mitigation, drone detection, all things related. Here on another episode of This Week in Drones, and it's gonna be great. We're gonna talk about policies. We're also gonna give you guys an update on the World Cup, FIFA, how things are progressing there. Lots of equipment deployed, lots of training, really complex operations, a lot of things going on, a lot of drones seized. You've probably been looking at it, Max. It looks like the latest is about 500 drones so far that they've published that they've seized of people. I'm sure I've not dug into who all owned those drones, but I'm sure it's a whole mix of folks that they're looking into now, that shouldn't have been flying, shouldn't have been bringing their drone near or around these stadiums and these different events. So we'll dive into all that. Safer Skies Act and kind of progress on that right now with an open comment time period for comments. So we'll hit that. There's the Seaport Security Act, with some comments on seaports and drones. Anyway, lots of things. I just figured I'd toss out a few of them to you guys listening, because we're going to hit all those. And again, feel free to send in questions if you have thoughts, if you want to hear from Max, Brett, Lauren on anything related to this topic or the topics we bring up. Just feel free to do that. So with that said, of course, I'm your host, David Lewin, here with Echodyne Radars. And it's been pretty exciting times regarding using radars across the globe, across the U.S. for all things, including FIFA, World Cup, for like detecting and tracking. And so happy to bring in, any thoughts I have throughout this conversation regarding sensors and detection and all that. But with that said, I'll toss it to Max, who's on my team, just to do a brief intro, and then to our special guests here today, starting with Brett Feddersen from Defend, and then Lauren Bresette from SIA, Security Industry Association. So yeah, Max.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Max Rosen, Director of Government Affairs for Echodyne. We continue to see a lot of momentum in this space. There's a lot of good topics for us to chat about today, both on the regulatory front, but also on the legislative front, with everything happening with NDAA and appropriations, and sort of being literally right in the middle of the year, but also right in the middle of these large legislative packages starting to move their way through the process. Lots of amendments out there related to the autonomy industry, the drone industry, the counter drone industry. Billions upon billions of dollars of funding in the appropriations bills that really do signal an increased demand and just an increased focus on the future of warfare on the defense side, and the future of several different commercial drone applications, which good progress is being made on a lot of those rulemakings. And so we'll dive into a lot of that today, but look forward to engaging here with Brett, who is with Defend, and I'll let him introduce himself next. Valued partner company of ours, and good friend of the company. So pass it over to Brett.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, David. Appreciate the opportunity today. So I'm Brett Feddersen, the Vice President of Strategy and Government Affairs at Defense Solutions. Defense Solutions is a RF cyber takeover counter UAS system, and it uses a very layered approach and integrates in that layered approach. David, as you were kind of mentioning, radar is extremely important to make sure that you can actually verify physical aspects out there when RF systems and sensors can't see it. And so it's a great partnership between our two companies to make the Enforce Air Plus that's out there, which has, again, our sensors and our capabilities to RF takeover, as well as the radars to identify other drones out there that are harder to see by RF sensors. So I'm happy to talk about these. These are all important issues, and you have the right team here with Max and Lauren who understand it quite well. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks, Brett. I'm Lauren Bresette. I'm the Associate Director of Government Relations at the Security Industry Association. And I'm also the staff liaison for our Drone Security Subcommittee. This is a subcommittee under our Government Relations Committee. So we focus a lot on advocating for the policies that can encourage counter drone authorities. I know that this group has been very active in making sure that the Safer Skies Act of 2026 got passed, which I know that we'll get into the implementation of that today. And this group has been working on these types of things since before I even joined SIA for years. So Brett Feddersen is the chair of that group. And it's in addition to being a place to advocate for these policies and kind of get really involved in the legislative process here, it's also very open to end users, manufacturers, integrators, all the folks along the security ecosystem in the counter drone and the drone space. So it's also a great forum to network with those folks and kind of talk about what issues we're seeing and what kind of things need to remain top of mind as we're going into these major events that are coming up, and then just also protecting these sites beyond just the major events that we're focused on.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining. And I did want to highlight today the main reason we got this crew together is that we're all part of that subcommittee, with the Security Industry Association under Lauren's leadership there, to come together as different. We happen to be manufacturers on this call, but as you mentioned, Lauren, there's end users involved as well in that subcommittee and, consultants, other folks. So we appreciate what you guys are doing. And I wanted to highlight it for those listening that if you're interested in being part of this subcommittee, feel free to reach out to Lauren as well. And, there's virtual meetings. We meet in person often as well at major events, whether it be like ISC West, we'll sit down with a big crew and meet. And so if you want to be part of that, the more insights that we have, the better, because you get these different perspectives and trying to detect and track and identify and mitigate drones. It varies widely depending on if you're at a seaport and you've got huge ships and cranes moving and ships coming in and out and all sorts of crazy noisy applications. Then it's a lot different than if you're in a huge kind of open field out in a rural area. And so anyways, various perspectives, various domains, all of us coming together is really essential. So thanks for what you guys do, Lauren. So with that said, I think one of the biggest, there's many items that's out there for legislation and open for comment right now is the interim final ruling for the Safer Skies Act, right? That currently has a window of time now open for comment. We're going to be putting together comments both as like a company, within Echodyne. I'm sure Defend as well. I'll let you guys speak to it, but then together we're accumulating comments under the subcommittee with SIA as well and presenting those comments. So I guess I will pass it to maybe we'll go kind of backwards through it. Lauren, if you want to just kind of address what the subcommittee is doing regarding the Safer Skies Act, and then Brett, if you want to kind of go into the details, and then feel free to comment in there, Max. But yeah, Lauren, tell us about this act and just kind of what the subcommittee's doing for that.
Yeah, definitely. Following up on the act being passed through the NDAA last year, there's a lot of pieces that need to happen for implementation, and this is really kind of the big one there. So just short history, headline of the act, it expands counter UAS authorities to state and local law enforcement and correctional agencies. And so this interim ruling is really important because it's the official DOJ, DHS final rule that's actually in effect as of July 1st, but it's an interim final rule, so it's open for comments until September 4th. And here at SIA, I can give you guys my email to post here, or I can add it in the chat or something like that. But we are collecting industry feedback on this through the Drone Security Subcommittee, so that we encourage folks to comment on the rule as their own companies, but then also we want to collect industry-wide feedback and speak as one voice on this as well too.
Beautiful. I'll figure out a way to get your email up on there. If nothing else in the comments, I'll add it down below on social media, but I'll see while Brett and Max are sharing if I can kind of like pop it up on screen real quick. But.
Yeah, okay. I want to start by hitting Lauren and David's comments for folks. We really believe in SIA's working group that it's building a coalition. that we're, collaborating to compete, which is great because we have all of the companies in there. But there's room for more people, more voices, different ways to kind of approach things like this rule. So that those aren't familiar with some of the government processes, rulemaking is the most bureaucratic and slow process that the government has. You'd be surprised that it actually kind of takes longer than legislation does to get developed, passed through, and run through. This rule is important, and rulemaking in general is to take legislation and develop the rules or policies and regulations that the industry or sector is going to have to do in order to meet the law that was passed, in this case, Safer Skies. And so the implementation of Safer Skies is in the interim final rule that was published by DOJ and DHS to address the issue with state and local law enforcement and prisons. Because the law only applies to those individuals, the rule is focused on those individuals and giving that authority so that state, local law enforcement and the prison system, whether it's private or public, can operate devices like the ones that we make to detect drones, track the drones, identify them, and then take a mitigation piece to stop whatever threat is being posed there, or an enforcement action, depending if there's a flight restriction in the area that needs to be enforced as well. This rule was well written. They're not easy to write. It was well thought out. I think it covers quite a few things. I think there is lots of opportunity for refinement. I don't want to say necessarily improvement, but things that the public comment period is extremely important for. And so I think to highlight some of the big things in there that, the IFR clarifies that there's specific training requirements for state and local law enforcement and for prisons, both on the detection and warning side, as well as the mitigation side. And really, when you talk about the industry, for those who may not know, you're always looking at detection, which is the way you see drones flying around, understanding the airspace and what's happening, whether drones are authorized or unauthorized, and where the pilot may be based on the systems that are being put out there. And then when all else fails about interdicting the pilot or addressing the issues, you really get into the mitigation piece. And there are both kinetic and non-kinetic ways to address mitigation. The safest way being non-kinetic, which is either taking control of the drone and landing it, or being able to talk to the pilot and have them land it for you without any type of mitigation action in place. Very important for law enforcement who were kind of rushed through the World Cup aspect of things and are out there using it quite well during the World Cup. Now all the other law enforcement departments in tribal territories as well are trying to figure out, well, how do we do this without being part of a federal task force? How do we do this independently, which is what the law gave them and granted them the ability to do? And this IFR, this interim final rule, lays out those steps for them of what they need to accomplish in order to meet the letter of the law and to be able to coordinate with interagency as well as be able to do their independent operations without a federal officer being right next to them. Yeah, so it's a big deal for us to finally get this and push it out. We have a lot of things in the future that are going to be impacted by this. One is everything post World Cup, any law enforcement actions that happen. Two, it's the expansion of the federal grants in the $250 million that we expect either at the end of this year, beginning of next year. And it allows individuals to better understand how they go about talking to manufacturers, seeing manufacturer performance, and then procuring stuff with those grant funds.
Yeah, I think the only other thing, two things I would add, we really can't overstate the importance of this rule and what it means for the industry. The last time the counter-drone authorities were meaningfully expanded was in 2018. So that was 8 years ago. And pretty much for the entirety of that 8 years, I and Brett and many others were directly involved in the lobbying effort. And I know, Lauren's organization too, have been involved in the effort to expand those authorities. And the World Cup, I think, really was the major forcing function to get it across the finish line, especially with all the money that was flowing down from FEMA and this, before the end of last year, inability for SLTT entities to Brett's point, independently use this technology to mitigate a threat without having to get the federal government involved. And as we all know, the window to address these threats is very, very small. The federal government is a very large, in some cases, slow-moving agency. Not the most proactive body in the world, right? They tend to be reactive to things, just sort of by nature of how they're constructed and all the things that they have on their plate. So it really is a huge deal that this came out, and I think it's an even bigger deal that it came out as an interim final rule versus an NPRM, a notice of proposed rulemaking, because that takes much longer, has to go through many regulatory hurdles where it has to be approved by folks within the agencies. In this case, there are two. Then it has to be approved by the folks over at OIRA and OMB at the White House, and it takes a long time. And that process has to happen twice when it's an NPRM, and then it has to happen again when the final rule is going to come out. And so it's a long process. So I definitely want to echo what Lauren said. If you're a member of her organization, or you're a member of another trade group or a coalition that is aggregating any sort of feedback from industry, send it, right? Whatever feedback you have, whatever thoughts you have, it's important that you file your own comments, but it's also important that you push that information through the organizations that you might be a part of. So it's a really big deal, and I want to emphasize that. Secondly, another part of the IFR is this whole idea of an approved equipment list, and there are two separate lists that are outlined in the IFR. There's not a lot of detail in the IFR itself about sort of what the vetting process will be and how exactly those lists will come together. And I think that gives industry an opportunity to advocate for very robust vetting processes to determine what technologies make it onto that list. Because it's really important that, we're all in this industry together. A lot of us are competitors with each other, but I think everyone on this podcast would agree that being competitive with each other is a good thing, because the more competitive the industry is, the better the industry does. And so I think there's an opportunity here for all of us to sort of come together and really push the federal government to create those lists and then maintain those lists after the fact in a way that maximizes the number of companies and the number of capable technologies that can be on that list. And we have seen in the past with the blue list, for example, which in some ways has been pretty mismanaged. We've seen ways that those types of lists can go wrong, and we've seen ways that DIU and DOD and the new agency that's overseeing Blue UAS, how they've sort of worked to rectify the process of creating that list and the process of maintaining that list over time. So for companies like us, for companies like Brett's who are actually manufacturing technologies, it's going to be really important for those companies to make their way onto that list. And I think in large part, the federal government is going to prioritize companies that have proven technology, that's capable, that's affordable, and is already in the field operating successfully today, whether it be at the World Cup, whether it be at the NFL draft earlier this year, or in the defense sector, where a lot of companies have been operating for a long time, because for all intents and purposes, DoD has really been the only major customer in the federal government of drone and counter drone tech up to this point. And we are seeing DoD, who deserves a ton of credit, really ramping up the amount of drones that they're buying through the Drone Dominance Initiative. And so all of these things are kind of coming together to create a much more prosperous industry, a much more competitive industry, and one that will continue to succeed for a long time. So it really is a big deal. And anyone on this call could answer any questions that you might have about the rule and the best way to position yourselves as a company. Brett and I both, and I'm sure Lauren too, have a lot of regulatory experience with filing these comments and using the right words and buzzwords and ways to get the agency to actually listen to what it is you want them to do.
That's great. Yeah, I was curious to hear from any of you guys, but even Lauren, as you're collecting comments from folks right now, what sorts of comments and questions come through out of, if someone out there, if an industry person is listening and they think, hey, maybe I want to jump in and comment, but maybe they're not as familiar with what that process looks like. I'm just curious, like what sorts of nuance do you see coming through that may differ between different companies, or, kind of take people into that world for a second?
Yeah, no, I mean, I will note that this initial rule has actually just come out as of the 6th. So we're very early on in that process of collecting feedback. But I will say that the things that we hear time and time again are exactly the things that Brett and Max mentioned. A lot of the detection authority comes up over and over again from companies. I've also heard many comments from folks with similar thoughts on the authorized equipment lists as well too. So I think that's definitely a topic that we'll get feedback on from industry, but I do know that there tends to actually be a lot of agreement across the industry on this, which is why it's very helpful to kind of speak as one voice. There's not a lot of times where we as an industry disagree on legislative efforts, because again, I think the important place where SIA comes in and why it's so important to work with your trade associations when you're advocating for legislative policies is that collaborate to compete aspect, all these companies want to be able to compete with each other, but in a field that makes sure that we can get these capabilities to counter drones to the right people. So I would just emphasize that there is a lot of agreement, but I definitely think that the authorized equipment list, detection capabilities, those are the types of things that we hear over and over again from our folks.
Beautiful. Oh, Max, go ahead. Or, yeah, Max, Brett, both of you.
Yeah, I was just going to add really quick. David, you mentioned to Lauren, what do you say to folks who might want to file comments but don't know where to begin? I mean, that is literally why a trade association exists, right? Like, that is a core. And I as many know, I worked at AUVSI for 4 years internally, and then I was a contract lobbyist for AUVSI for 4 years prior to that. That is why trade associations exist, to help guide you, point you in the right direction, help you with your comments, gather information and put quality comments out there that are emblematic of the views of a whole industry, right? And in many cases, federal agencies who are releasing rules like this, they take a really close look at the trade association comments, because they know that the perspectives of 100, 200, 500, however many member companies a trade organization has, all of those folks contributed to creating these comments. And so there's a lot of value in as many trade groups and coalitions and different sort of interest groups filing comments as possible. And I think, to Lauren's point, the folks at AUVSI, the folks at the Commercial Drone Alliance, Lauren's organization, if the Consumer Technology Association does something, whoever ends up, I think a lot of them are going to say the same thing, because there is a lot of broad agreement on this issue across the industry and how exactly to promulgate a final rule that maximizes safety first and foremost, but creates rules of the road for folks to operate under and exercise this authority under, that ensures, they're reacting in the right way to the right threat, right? There are a lot of legitimate drone operations that are happening, and those absolutely need to be protected, right? That's a huge concern of some of the other folks in this industry, is what will this mean for legitimate drone operations? What if we have a state or local police officer who doesn't know what they're doing, and they pull a legitimate drone operation out of the sky that's delivering a live organ to a transplant patient, right? Like, that is a legitimate concern. And so I think there'll be a lot of sentiment in the industry that whatever the final rule looks like, it has to make sure that it protects those legitimate drone operations moving forward. And that's going to be, imperative, because, I don't want to fearmonger, but one incident could really upend this entire industry very, very quickly, right? It's not a long-standing industry like commercial aviation that's been around for however many years, right? And it's important that we all work together to make sure that we minimize that risk, uphold the highest standards of safety, and we can't do that unless we all work together and collaborate through groups like Lauren's and AUVSI and all these other groups that are out there for this very purpose.
I think that's a great point. And pulling a little bit more on the threat, I think it's important for people to understand and know that the security threat is out there. We get hit sometimes. Well, you guys are manufacturing systems, so you're going to say there's a threat out there so you can sell more systems. The truth of the matter is, counter UAS is a little bit of a misnomer. Systems that are out there, like like ours and the Echodyne radar system that integrates with it, provides air domain awareness. It's a safety function first, knowing what's flying around in the airspace, what's going on. And we know just as well as manned aircraft that there are security risks that are associated with that. And so the ability to see what's flying and an ability to enforce or stop an action are extremely important. These are both going hand in hand. Counter UAS systems, again, I don't know, there should be a different name for it, but these systems are providing air domain awareness that also integrate into the unmanned traffic management systems that are being built by NASA and the UN and the FAA. It is going to be a picture so that we can, again, enable the proliferation of legal drone activity that's out there. And I think there's also something that we kind of confused out there for years. We've been told about careless and clueless actors. There's really only two ways to fly your drone, whether you're a hobbyist or a professional drone pilot. You can either fly it legally or you can fly it illegally. And then again, that's where the enforcement actions and the penalties come into place. So even as a hobbyist, you have to understand the rules of the road and what's going on with it. It's important for, I think, the audience to understand that there is a real threat that's out there. It is, in the overall scheme of things, when we're doing mitigations, we're doing it to make sure that things are safe and that threat or potential threat could actually be stopped. But you're right, it's all about enabling really kind of the new type of aviation infrastructure that the U.S. is going to have in the next 20 years. And that's going to be manned aviation, that's going to be vertical takeoff and landing aircraft and the advanced air mobility aspect of it. And it's going to be drone operations through a myriad of benefits that it gives society. But being able to see that and protect individuals from anything that may go wrong is incredibly important.
Yeah, one thing I want to kind of segue into is the World Cup. And curious, from like Brett, if you want to kick it off, like, I'm sure that folks out there, listeners, are wondering, how are things going? What's actually happening regarding drones, regarding drone mitigation, regarding, detections, all the things happening, confiscation of drones, seizing of drones. I mentioned a number earlier, but I think on the back channel, you said it was a little bit more higher in terms of like the number of drones that have now been seized by the, the feds. I guess just like take us into that world. I'm really curious. And part of my thinking here is just, where's the education gap too? Like, is this part of the move for them to say, guys, we're serious, go learn how to do this legally, because things are going to shift now away from just like the conversation with law enforcement where they warn you and they educate you and they tell you to go to a website. Like, is that going to change, out and about, or is law enforcement going to crack down a lot harder on Johnny, who got his drone for Christmas and didn't take a second look at it, but it's like a phantom, it's like a big size drone that needs to be registered, yada, yada. Like, I mean, is that, I don't know, thoughts on all that would be great.
Yeah, so let me start with the World Cup. First off, there was a lot of planning and coordination that came into preparing for the World Cup. I know things kind of happened fast. I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks that we had in that preparation was the fact that DHS wasn't funded for so long, and was hard to allow them to do what they're supposed to do. But they pulled it off extraordinarily well as the FBI. State and local law enforcement, Echodyne and Defend are being used at a majority of the locations, whether it's airports or whether it's fan zones or whether it's at the actual stadium. There have been over 600 seizures so far. That is not all necessarily mitigation, but that is an important piece to it, right? So the way operations are set up and the way law enforcement is trained is to develop planning so that you can see the area you're protecting and find the operator. And the first thing is preferred is interdicting that operator. I will say that I've seen other events of high caliber where local law enforcement and federal law enforcement are paired up together and respond within literally 5 minutes of a drone being launched or a drone being detected, and being able to talk to the pilot. And honestly, most of those are warnings, kind of like speeding tickets on the roads. But there are often people that are very unremorseful, kind of indifferent to the fact and don't understand why law enforcement is taking their drone from those situations. And investigations go on, and prosecutions have successfully happened, both at the federal level as well as the state and local level. where arrests because of ordinance or state laws are allowed there as well. So kudos to everybody that's in the World Cup and doing the World Cup. And this is, basically the central function being done by the FBI and by DHS, with components kind of owning different areas, as we have all these different cities here in the United States, doing these events. They are there 24/7. They are constantly monitoring the airspace. They are coordinating directly with agents on the ground and local officers in different areas, as well as the FAA. So this is a great, not only have we done this safely now without incident since the beginning of the games, but it is providing us lessons learned, little mistakes or little things that happen, or techniques that need to be improvised or kind of built on in order to make sure we do it safely and make sure we're operating in its direction. So for those that don't know, this isn't the first time counter UAS has been used in the U.S. for these events. It's been used through national security events. It's also been used through the Super Bowl, the World Series, the NFL draft, and different things like that. So the importance of counter UAS as a security layer, both physically and cyber-wise, is incredibly important. And what we're seeing right now, game to game, is the exact type of operations that have been planned for, and the execution has been extremely successful. So again, I can't say enough good things about the federal and state and local law enforcement cooperation and coordination in this effort, or the interagency player with FAA and the different departments there as well. So enjoying the World Cup and watching the great games, but what you're not seeing is just as important, and that is the activities that are identifying drone threats and stopping those drone threats.
Yeah, and I just want to double down. I agree with everything Brett said, but I just want to double down on one thing. I think when I've probably used these words on these podcasts before, but when people talk about drone operators, to Brett's earlier point, they talk about operators who are careless, clueless, or nefarious. And what is important to, and Brett, I think, put it very well, you either operate it legally or you operate it illegally. The statistics that we're seeing coming out of DHS and all the other agencies are saying, okay, 300 drones, now it's 400, now it's 500 were seized. They didn't break that down into 150 of those were careless operators, 200 of those were clueless, and however many more were nefarious, right? Those were 500 drone operators who were doing something with a drone that they weren't supposed to be doing. Whether they were clueless, they were careless, or they were nefarious, that's not really important at the end of the day. What's important at the end of the day is they were somewhere they weren't supposed to be, they were doing something they weren't supposed to do, and therefore their drone was seized. And so I don't think we're going to get that information from the FBI and DHS, right? We're just going to continue to get these raw numbers, this raw data of here's how many platforms we've seized. Maybe they'll come out with more information about the number that were mitigated. Maybe they'll come out with a really large number of just the number of drones that were tracked. And to Brett's point, they issued a warning, and then the person reacted accordingly. But it just goes to show that the threat is there, and regardless of you have somebody who truly is doing something nefarious, or you have Jimmy who got his drone for Christmas and put it up in the sky and flew it somewhere he wasn't supposed to, completely unbeknownst to him, it's still seen as a threat through the eyes of state and local law enforcement, federal officials who, to Brett's point, are working together to make sure that none of these drones can do anything that they're not supposed to do, right? And that is the exact reason why all this money flowed down to the state governments and the SLTT entities. That's why they went out and purchased all of this equipment, right? That's why folks are going down to the training academy in Huntsville to learn how to use it. And, the last thing I'll say is I do think there's also a role for the manufacturers to play, companies like Echodyne and companies like Defend, to also help educate the folks that are using the technology, right? We are the companies that are building it. We are the ones who have world-class engineers who are actually putting these pieces of technology together, calibrating them, making sure they're operating in the appropriate way. And, we at Echodyne, and I'm sure Brett and Defend did the same thing. We were very forthcoming with our federal partners and state partners. Like, if you need anything during the World Cup, we're here. Like, we are here to help you. We are here to support you. And that type of industry and government collaboration is really important, especially when you're talking about the drone and counter drone industry, which again, compared to commercial aviation and other types of applications, is an industry that is still very much in its nascency, right? And so it's really important that we keep those lines of communication open. And in my view, the World Cup, I guess technically the NFL draft before that, but the World Cup is really the first major litmus test of this technology being rolled out and used by state and local officials with robust oversight and partnership with the folks at the federal level. And so far, based on the, sort of inside baseball that Brett and I live in every day, and Lauren as well, and some of the public reporting, it really does seem to be going very, very well. And the public is not hearing a lot about it. That's a good thing, right? That means it's working. That means that things are going well. So in my view, with all that's going on in the World Cup, it's almost like no news is good news, right? Because that means that things are going according to plan.
It's not like the light just got turned on. The education process about the illegality of flying drones has been out there since 2018. And it's not just us talking about it. It's the departments and agencies. Even the FAA even had manufacturers of drones put pamphlets inside their drones. So when you open it up with the instructions, there are also some fairly basic rules of the road and where you need to go to find more information. I mean, it is the responsibility of the pilot of a drone. Again, whether you're a hobbyist or whether you're a professional pilot that's using a drone to make some money, you have to be able to understand what roads you're allowed to be on, what airways you're allowed to fly, when you're allowed to fly, when you're not, and who to contact if there's an issue. All the same things that we do as drivers on the road. They have a license. It's the same type of aspect that has to be followed.
And I think I'll just kind of bookend this conversation too by just saying it's great to talk about the World Cup. And I think it's amazing to really get into a discussion about the successes that we've been seeing from these technologies, because to Max's point, if the security industry is doing well, you're never going to hear about it. And that's a good sign for us, but then it's really hard to kind of communicate that to folks about the importance of having these types of technologies to defend these events. And so as we move forward, past the World Cup, and then, there's the Olympics coming up in 2028, and there are all these like really great opportunities to kind of provide more of these litmus tests where there's a lot of focus on these technologies and a lot of collaboration. But part of the importance of expanding this authority beyond just the federal law enforcement to state and local law enforcement is that it's impossible to cover everything in the United States with just the federal resources. It even goes beyond that to when you don't have all of this focus on these big events that are coming up, and it falls on the state and local law enforcement, even things like critical infrastructure or large gatherings that maybe there isn't so much of a focus on, those things can easily fall to the wayside too, which is why from a legislative perspective, we're really focused on like continuing to make sure that this technology is pushed to the critical infrastructure operators and the folks that need it, kind of building on the successes that we're seeing where we get a lot of this focus and this attention on these big events to make sure that all of this is happening in the background everywhere that we do actually need these technologies.
Yeah, I think that's an important point.
Oh, go for it, Brett.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. The Safer Skies Act, when it was passed last December, calls for a report from DOJ and DHS on whether or not state and local law enforcement can effectively cover critical infrastructure. That's supposed to come out in December of this year. However, we already know that that it is kind of a very cumbersome concept for state and local law enforcement to protect privately owned nuclear plants, oil and gas companies, stadiums, things that aren't covered by the law enforcement on a regular basis, right? We already have a police officer shortage in the U.S. Departments aren't giving any type of funding for this kind of stuff except for grants right now. And there are coordination between commercial entities and critical infrastructure, where critical infrastructure is willing to buy equipment and put it in place so that state and local law enforcement can use it. But these are things that aren't really clarified. These are things that need to be clearly brought out, whether it's in rulemaking or whether it's in new legislation. But we have to be able to make sure that the entire country has a capability to be able to see what's flying in their airspace and enable those that are authorized to actually do mitigation to stop them from flying over very important areas like nuclear power plants or even, military bases and airports.
That's great. I think that leads us to the next topic, which is what's going to happen after the World Cup regarding the ability for state and local law enforcement to mitigate drones. I mean, to also be able to track and identify and detect, track, identify, and that whole piece as well, which has had some legislative hurdles, along with the what are we allowed to do about it if we detect it? Can we take it over? Can we land it? What are the rules of that road? And I think I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and your thoughts on this AG letter that just came out recently, I guess about a month ago, that seemed to state that, like, overall to encourage federal courts to basically, keep in mind, or I guess, or maybe give like a pass to folks that, law enforcement that are following the protocols and deem it necessary to interdict a drone on a state local level that could technically possibly break a federal law, right? I mean, at the very moment. So I think that letter came out to say, can we hang tight on prosecuting for those, those specific use cases, so that law enforcement's doesn't have their hands completely tied. And I heard about it, from one of our law enforcement buddies in the industry, and he thought it was good, however, still loose, meaning like they felt like they totally could still be prosecuted. It was just nice if they wouldn't be, a nice thought. So I'm just curious, like, where do we go from here? Where does that AG letter come into play? Where does the Safer Skies Act come into play? This training at the FBI, center, training law enforcement on mitigation. Like, I mean, what happens next after this special window we're in during the World Cup, where some law enforcement is able to mitigate as sort of like a extension of the FBI and DHS on site, right? But then that ends, and now we're back to business as usual. We've got ports, airports, electric utilities, all these things that need coverage at a state level. What's going to happen over the next so many months or 6 months or whatever there? I guess, Brett, take it away.
So first off, the letter's good. The idea that the Attorney General and Department of Justice as a whole can identify that the laws are very complicated. It's hard to understand, and we're in the middle of a new law being implemented and individuals being trained in order to do it. So good for them for understanding that, hesitation in learning or training or buying stuff would really put us farther behind the power curve when it comes to securing the airspace and stopping drone threats. So I think the intent was in the right place to go ahead and say that, hey, we're not going to prosecute you during this period of learning and understanding. I think the sticking point is that the legal word should was in there, should not prosecute, instead of a more directive word like shall not prosecute. I think that was the dividing factor that a lot of law enforcement, including myself, picked up on. But it does talk about, again, persons working for or with state and local law enforcement. Again, pointing out that this is a collaborative effort between critical infrastructure and law enforcement and the different efforts that are going out there. We're also not quite sure why they put an end date or a sunset date to this. That kind of leads to the fact or implies that maybe prosecution will start in January of 2027. I don't think that was the intent, but there was definitely a sunset clause that was in there. And again, this is a grace period for 180 days, right? That takes us to the end of the year, where both the FCC is granted a temporary authorization for law enforcement to use systems that interfere with different airways and different radio functions. And then on top of that, the IFR, right? The interim final rule that shows and explains the implementation process and how training should be done. I think we all agree, and we talk about it quite regularly. The FBI has done a phenomenal job at standing up a school. But between concept to actually developing a school and putting it in play was 8 months, which is extremely fast for the federal government. So kudos to them for doing it, and a great curriculum that is being shared with other federal agencies as well. The problem being is that that schoolhouse needs to grow in instructors and capabilities in order to allow 18,000 departments across the U.S. to receive the proper training and be able to do what they're supposed to do, which is, again, that entire safety aspect and security aspect with mitigation. I think what we're going to find out here post World Cup is that $250 million that was given to the World Cup cities, remember 11 cities, several departments across there, the next $250 million has to be peanut butter spread across all the other 50 states and departments and territories. So they're going to end up getting a much smaller cut of the pie when it comes down to it. They're going to have to be very selective as to what they buy and what they operate. And then they're going to have to be able to get individuals into a very small pipeline of training at the federal level down in Huntsville, Alabama. And again, this is not an FBI problem or really a kind of a DOJ issue, that we just need to figure out a way to open up that pipeline, whether it's more instructors or taking the curriculum and doing satellite campuses, or even going and allowing the contractors and companies out there that make a living on training law enforcement that could then add this to their list as well. These are the type of things that we're doing. I think DHS should also have a training program that allows for the rest of the interagency and even prisons to be able to get into the training pipeline. It's the only way we can scale and get ahead of the threat. Each day we delay is a day where we're putting out a risk that something catastrophic may happen, whether it's an aircraft that was hit, which we see quite a bit. Matter of fact, LAPD helicopter had to make an emergency landing the other day because they were struck by a drone in flight. Or, there's actual terroristic intention in there where somebody's dropping grenades or bombs and killing people. These are the things that we're trying to deal with in order to make it safe to be on the ground with an airspace above us. But they have to happen, and they have to happen quicker than we currently have a plan to make it happen.
And that's part of why we're seeing, though, so much activity on a policy level from the current administration in the last, whatever it's been, last 12 months, right? So tough to navigate all that, but kudos to them for just shoving it all out there and being like, well, we'll turn this one loose and get comments, even if people think, oh, that might not have been fully ready to go out. They just put it out, and it seemed like they did that with 2209. They did that with Part 108, maybe at different levels. I don't have to comment on exactly how thorough each one was already vetted before it went out, but it just seems like either way, they're putting them out at various levels of maturity just to get them out there, so that the industry can comment, so that they can just start, kind of to get ahead, because we've been lagging for a bit, right? I mean, shoot, they've put out policies on like every topic within the drone world just in the last months. It's been crazy, but I'm hopeful that give it a little bit of time, give it 6 months, give it a year, we'll be in a really, really good spot with like how to put flight restrictions over critical infrastructure that delivery drones can still fly through if they have the right launch approvals, etc. Right? I mean, and like we'll end up with full domain awareness, full awareness of what's in the air, low altitude airspace via radars and sensors, right, across the board, and then we'll be able to mitigate what needs to be mitigated. We'll be all of it's coming. It's just we're right in the cusp right now. Kind of right in between, but it used to be, right, like when I first joined Echodyne about 5 years ago, it seems like all the meetings were like still like almost nothing yet, crickets on each thing. Just give us more data, and then eventually we're going to put out a NPRM or a rulemaking procedure on this. But now, like, man, we've had so many potential rules and draft rules and things, and policies come into play. Like, if they all come together, we're going to be in a good spot. I guess with that said,
it's been a priority.
Yeah, exactly. I guess next like couple minutes as we close out, where do you guys think we need to be? Like, what needs to land in the next, let's just say like by the end of this year, for that vision to really become a reality in through 2027? Like obviously safer skies, different one. Just what do you want to comment on if one or two of these truly land, and if you have any comments on like what may be missing or anything there, just insights kind of on where we're at and where we should be, would be great. Max, you're off mute. You want to toss it?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off and then pass it over to Lauren and Brett. I think There's a couple different things, and I think Brett already started to allude to this a bit. There is another $250 million that is, a pile of money that is set aside for next year. That money is going to go a lot less far than the initial 250, right? Because the initial 250 went to the 11 host cities and the state administrative agencies. So, California and Texas, for example, got 30 some odd million between LA, San Francisco, Dallas, and Houston. St. Louis got like 7 million, right? Which is a much, much smaller number. So the 250 million that gets dispersed for next year is going to go across the whole country. So there's going to be much smaller pockets of money for states to buy and SLTT entities to buy this technology. So in my view, more federal funding will be needed for state and local law enforcement agencies around the country, many of whom are already very strapped for resources to purchase, expensive pieces of equipment comparative to their, whole operating budget, right? Not every police department has the resources of the LAPD or the Chicago PD or the NYPD or the Miami PD, right? What about your, rural police department in North Dakota or your rural police department in Idaho, right? Who has the same authority if they go through the training and they do all the things that they're supposed to do. They're going to need more, I think, financial support from the federal government to actually procure those technologies. There are also state grants like state economic development grants and other, lines of money that they can pursue. But I think that there'll need to be a consistent sort of federal purse string to support some of those purchases. So I think that is a big thing. We started talking about it a little bit, this idea of, private entities, private companies and corporations having the ability to detect and mitigate drones on their own without the need of support from a state entity, a local entity, or a federal entity. A lot of the folks that we're talking about, data centers, oil and gas, utilities, pipelines, like these are large corporations who, for all intents and purposes, probably don't need federal funding to procure this technology. But what they do need is the authority to be able to do something about a threat that they see above whatever the critical infrastructure may be, right? A data center, a pipeline, a railroad, plenty of different examples out there. There is legislation floating around out there that would, introduced by Senator Cotton and some other folks, that would effectively do that for a certain number of industries. There's also been a push to expand counter-UAS authority to the National Guard when they're operating under Title 32 status, which is being called by a state governor under state orders versus being called by the federal government under Title 10, which is the statute that governs the U.S. military. So that's another thing that's floating around out there. There was an amendment filed in the House. There's some amendments filed in the Senate to the NDAA to solve that problem and close what I believe is, and I think others would agree, a pretty significant gap in authorities now that the SLTT folks have it, the feds have it, but, there are others in the ecosystem that should have that authority. So while the Safer Skies Act was a huge step in the right direction, I think there are additional common sense steps that Congress can and should take to expand that authority even further with federal oversight and ensuring that they're appropriately trained and that they're using the equipment, safely and smartly. And lastly, I think it goes without saying, like, the BVLOS rule needs to get across the finish line this year. Like, that is something that absolutely has to happen. That is something that, the FAA has fallen behind on, which, no, not throwing shade against the FAA. It's very common for federal agencies to just fall a little bit behind in the rulemaking process because they have so much on their plate. And quite frankly, in many cases, not enough people, not enough resources to actually push the paper, write the rules, get them through the interagency process, and get them out there for public comment, and then ultimately, being finally published in the Federal Register. So that has to happen. The 2209 rule, needs to move forward this year. All of these things are coming to a head where we're like on the 10-yard line, but we just need that extra push to get into the end zone. And if all of those things were to happen this year, from last summer to the end of this year, that year and a half, the biggest year and a half for the drone industry, bar none, and will really chart the course for the future of the industry and all of the key companies and players within it.
I can go next here, Brett, if you want the final word on this, but I'll just kind of reiterate everything that what Max was saying. I think especially the pieces on funding and the pieces on, continued authority, whether that comes through like a legislative process that can be a little bit longer, take more than a year, or an explicit rulemaking from a federal agency. You saw from the Attorney General, they saw the need to act with urgency, and so they acted. So there are many ways that this can be expanded. And we're seeing a lot of really important progress on this point. Safer Skies was a huge piece of legislation. The fact that we've been seeing such an urgency from the folks who know that this needs to happen has been really great. And one thing that, we always talk about, what can you as the industry do? What can you as the manufacturers, the integrators, the end users do? And the really important thing is, as we're in this period of, success stories with the World Cup, seeing Safer Skies get implemented, watching this burgeoning industry really take off and provide all these great capabilities, it's so important that you make sure that you're reporting on this as much as possible. We've talked about the federal government always likes to have data. Brett's mentioned that there's reports going out that that are going to come back to the federal agencies as well too. So really making sure that when you're working with your federal partners, when you're working with your state and local partners, all of these successes and the importance of these programs are really being emphasized, not only publicly, but also, directly with anyone, your trade associations, anyone at your companies that work government affairs, making sure that you're really reporting back on the successes of these, because every time the cycle comes around from Congress to see whether authorities need to be expanded or whether they need to refund a grant program, they're going to look at how that money was spent and how those authorities were used. And it's really, really important that you show that both there's a need for more funding, but also that the funding is being very successfully executed too. So.
Great. Yeah, Brett, if you want to take the final word in the next minute or so.
Public-private partnerships, extremely important, like Max was saying and Lauren was talking about. The federal government can't fund everything, and they can't give grants to 18,000 departments across the United States and then not even think about the private industry parts of it. So public-private partnership has to be enabled in order to fund what we truly need to become a security element that we're used to on a daily basis. That will take some time and scale, but it needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. Legal clarity on the detection aspects of things. Again, we have antiquated laws that were put in place to do good things, protect privacy, but they did not foresee what we're talking about when we say detection for drones flying in the airspace. The systems that are out there are purely pulling the type of data that is already required by the FAA to be broadcast. And so it's important to understand that data is, one, aeronautical communication, so it's exempt from wiretap, and that two, the systems are not pen trap and trace type systems that are listening to specific emails, phone calls, videos, and that type of thing. That this can be done either through legislation, which is a much longer, painful route. It can really easily be done at the DOJ level if the Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General were to make a policy and understand and how that interpretation should be done. That needs to happen as soon as possible. That would be a high priority to finish before the end of the year and before we start at it again, scaling up operations kind of worldwide. I think the last comment is, for folks that are out there that want to get involved or need assistance in being heard, join Security Industry Association or other associations out there that are actively advocating on behalf of not just the industry, but the users that are out there as well.
Beautiful. Well, thanks guys for joining the panel today. And everyone out there listening, feel free to reach out to anyone on this panel, find us on LinkedIn, or go back and I posted the ribbon on the screen there for a little bit of Lauren's email. If you want to email her, get involved with the committee, or send comments for the Safer Skies Act while that is still open here for the next month or two, I guess. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.